We've finished classical conditioning. Now we're going to work on a second type of learning called operant conditioning. But before we do that, I want to do just a little bit of compare and contrast between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So, as you recall, classical conditioning occurs when we learn an association between two stimuli, the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, and the responses to the neutral stimulus are then called a conditioned response. The neutral stimulus is called a conditioned stimulus, and it involves involuntary responses. Now, operant conditioning is also really rooted in behaviorism, and operant conditioning, though, looks at voluntary responses or voluntary behaviors. And the idea with operant conditioning is that we learn an association between our behavior or response and the consequences of that response or behavior. And these are all voluntary responses and behaviors, so really different from classical conditioning. Hopefully you read about Edward Thorndike's research with the puzzle box and the cats. If you haven't, read about that, or you can check out the video I posted in Blackboard that kind of summarizes his research. But basically, through a process of trial and error, the cats had learned that certain behaviors caused the consequence of getting out of the puzzle box, and also access to food. And if you're a hungry cat, that's a pretty good consequence. So because certain behaviors produced certain consequences, it affected those behaviors. Thorndike came up with several laws of learning. The one that is kind of the core law of learning related to operant conditioning is called the law of effect. And the law of effects simply states that behaviors that produce good consequences tend to be repeated in the future, and behaviors that produce bad consequences tend not to be repeated in the future. Now, you can think of operant conditioning really even more so than classical conditioning in terms of everyday behaviors, because they're much more apparent. B.F. Skinner, who was one of the most famous behaviorists, would try to think about pretty much any voluntary behavior and try to track it to whatever consequence had produced that behavior in the past. And that's why the behaviorist said that our behavior was largely a function of our environment, because it's the consequences that are in place for us in the environment, the potential consequences, the contingencies that people place on our behavior that influence them. For example, over the years I've won some awards for teaching. This one. This one. My behavior of teaching produces consequences that are good for me. They're valuable to me. And that motivates me to continue to work hard as a teacher. I also like to run. I don't have any of my trophies or awards here to show you, but I've earned some trophies for running. And when I earn a trophy, it makes me want to try even harder and run more. So, if good consequences tend to increase behaviors, and bad consequences tend to decrease behaviors, sometimes we can use that knowledge to manipulate people's behaviors. Just as perhaps you've experienced as a college student, we expect you to do a certain amount of work. And one way that we encourage you or motivate you to do that work is to provide a consequence of points or letter grades as a way to make sure you do that work. And you think about it, sometimes it's pretty effective, because if we ask students to learn some material, but there was no consequence involved in learning that, how many students would actually take the time to learn it? So sometimes we have to use those consequences as a way to shape good behavior. Sometimes we use consequences as a way to shape behavior when it's bad too. I'm going to show you a video here in a little bit involving a little kid. And this little child is going to be repeating the same behaviors over and over and over again. And I want you to think about that in the context of operant conditioning. why was that child crying and crying and crying? Because you know, it's only cried when the parents were in view. Well, as you probably understand from an operant conditioning perspective, that child is probably used to getting some kind of good consequence for crying. That is, when he cries, he usually gets picked up, he probably gets hugged, he probably gets squeezed and nurtured. And that consequence is good for the child, and the child has learned that the behavior of crying will produce that consequence. Kids are pretty smart. So let's focus a little bit on the aspect what we call reinforcement, when our behaviors increase. So these are all good consequences, but there's two different types of reinforcement. And reinforce something means to strengthen it. So if we're talking about reinforced behaviors, we're talking about behaviors that become more likely in the future because of the consequences. But there's two types of reinforcements we want to consider: positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. You really want to think of positive and negative reinforcement in almost mathematical terms. They're both reinforcements, so we know in both cases it's the behavior is being strengthened because the consequence of the behavior is good. The difference, though, what's the difference between a positive and a negative? Well, that really boils down to almost mathematical terms. So, positive reinforcement, think of positive as adding. Like in math. Positive means to add. Negative means to subtract or remove. And that's how I want you to think about this. If you engage in a behavior and the consequence is that you get something that you like, that is a positive reinforcement because something was added. There are also times where we engage in a behavior and the consequence of that behavior is the removal or avoidance of something that we don't like. Well, that's still a good outcome. That's why it's a reinforcer. That's why it's a reinforcement. It will strengthen your behavior. But the point is that something that you don't like was removed, or something unpleasant was removed or subtracted. That makes it a negative reinforcement. So, to give you a couple examples of that, when I teach and I work hard, I get a reward. If I get some kind of an award for that, for running, I get awards for running, whatever, I'm getting something. It's a positive reinforcement, and it motivates me to work harder as a teacher or to continue to work hard as a teacher. What if I had a headache, which is unpleasant, and I decide to take some Tylenol or something? And I take some Tylenol, that's my behavior, my voluntary behavior. And the consequence of that is that my headache goes away. Well, that's a negative reinforcement because taking the Tylenol produces a consequence of something unpleasant being removed. So that's where the subtraction comes into place. And if you look on the screen, you see this picture here. This was called a Skinner box, and it was one of many contraptions that B.F. Skinner, the famous behavioral psychologist, developed to test different contingencies and what effect they had on behaviors. And one of the things in here would be that the rat could learn to do different things to get different types of reward, like food and water. So pressing the bar, for example, could result in the distribution of a food pellet. And the rats were generally kept slightly hungry, so food was always something that they really liked and very valuable to them. The cartoon shows a little girl who has crawled into bed with mom and dad after having woken up in the middle of the night crying, and she says, "I'll have to wake up crying in the middle of the night more often now." And she's learned in that cartoon that when she wakes up in the middle of the night and cries, the consequence is that she gets to sleep with her mom and dad. And that's one of the reasons why some parents do not let their kids crawl into bed with them when they wake up crying in the middle of the night, because they don't want the kid to learn that there's a positive consequence for walking in their room crying at night. So, parents have to make lots of decisions on a daily basis about how to handle situations involving their kids and the consequences of the child's behavior. Oftentimes, we want to manipulate those in a way to increase the child's good behaviors. So we might give them a treat when they do something good. Some kids get an allowance for performing certain tasks around the house. Those are all designed to increase their behavior. Sometimes the behavior isn't good though, and we want to decrease that behavior. So anytime we're talking about decreasing behavior, we're getting into the topic of punishments. And this is part of the law of effect, is that behaviors that produce unpleasant consequences tend to be repeated less often in the future. Well, just like reinforcement, we have two types of punishment, positive and negative. And you can think of these in mathematical terms as well. The main difference here, though, is that punishments decrease behavior, whereas reinforcements increase behavior. So a positive punishment would be adding something unpleasant that would then, as a consequence, and that would decrease the behavior. A negative punishment would be to remove or subtract something pleasant so that the behavior would decrease. And so if you think of examples of this, let's say maybe a child mouths off to his parent, and the consequence is that he has to put a bar of soap in his mouth for a period of time. That would be a positive punishment because the child is getting something is added that's unpleasant. And hopefully, because that consequence is unpleasant to the child, he'd be less likely to mouth off to his parent in the future. A negative punishment might be just removing a privilege from the child. So that's decreasing the behavior because the child has learned that the behavior causes them to miss out on something that they like. So if you've ever had your car keys taken away from you because you were late for curfew, perhaps, or you've had your Xbox or game system removed, those would all be forms of negative punishment. So I'm going to show you another video, and this video I want you to be thinking about to predict the type of punishment involved.
Zazu condoms. Fun, sexy, safe.
Well, that usually catches most students a little by surprise, as it did me the first time I saw that clever little ad there. But most people are probably thinking the child is going to get punished in some way, when in fact it really ties into operant conditioning in terms of the adult's behavior. And the idea there being having unprotected sex could cause a consequence like that. Perhaps he'd be less likely to have unprotected sex in the future if that is the consequence, and that's bothersome to him. So, a little funny twist on that. This slide here, I've just kind of reiterated what we just covered, and I'm not going to go through all that, but you can pause the video if you want to review that. Otherwise, that's kind of the end of my coverage of positive and negative punishments and positive and negative reinforcements. Again, feel free to pause the video if you want to review that. We'll have some practice problems for you to work on for class, though.